Something is happening inside your body right now that you cannot feel. Your cells are producing less energy than they did 10 years ago. Not because you are sick, not because you are doing something wrong. Because the machinery inside your cells, the part responsible for turning food into fuel, is slowing down, quietly, gradually, without any obvious warning sign. I am Dr. Warren Hung, and this is We Care Health. Today I am going to explain something that most people over 60 are never told clearly. Your metabolism, the system that decides how much energy your body makes and how it uses that energy, does not just slow down with age the way most people think. That phrase, slow metabolism, gets thrown around so loosely that it has lost all meaning. What is actually happening is far more specific. And once you understand the specific part that changes, you can understand why one particular addition to your morning coffee can trigger a measurable response in your metabolic machinery, sometimes within days. But first, we need to get clear on what metabolism actually is, because most people have the wrong picture in their heads. When people say metabolism, they usually mean, how fast do I burn calories? That is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Metabolism is the full set of chemical reactions your body runs every second of every day to keep you alive. Breaking down food, building new tissue, repairing damaged cells, regulating your body temperature, manufacturing hormones, keeping your brain active even while you sleep. All of that is metabolism. Now, inside almost every cell in your body, there are tiny structures called mitochondria. Think of them as small power generators. They take the food you eat after your digestive system has broken it down, and they convert it into a form of energy your cells can actually use. That energy molecule is called ATP. Every muscle contraction, every nerve signal, every heartbeat depends on ATP. Without it, nothing works. When you are younger in your 20s, 30s, even 40s, those mitochondria are running at high capacity. They are efficient. They are numerous. A single muscle cell can contain thousands of them. But after 60, two things begin to change. First, you lose mitochondria. Not all at once, slowly over years. The total number of these power generators in your muscle cells decreases. This is partly because you are also losing muscle mass itself, a process called sarcopenia. Less muscle means fewer mitochondria. Fewer mitochondria means less energy production. Less energy production means your baseline metabolic rate, the energy you burn just by being alive, drops. Second, the mitochondria that remain become less efficient. They still work, but they produce less ATP per unit of fuel. Think of an old generator that still runs but wastes more fuel to produce the same electricity. Your cells experience something similar. The conversion process becomes leakier. More energy is lost as waste. Less is available for your body to use. This is why so many people over 60 report feeling like their energy has dropped, even when nothing else in their life has changed. They sleep the same hours, they eat the same food, but the machinery processing that food into usable energy is not performing the way it used to. And here's the part that matters most for what we are going to talk about today. This is not just about energy levels. When your mitochondrial function declines, your body also becomes worse at handling blood sugar, worse at regulating fat storage, worse at responding to insulin. These are not separate problems. They are all downstream effects of the same upstream issue: reduced cellular energy production. So when someone over 60 says, "My metabolism is slow," what they are really describing, without knowing it, is a decline in mitochondrial number and efficiency, combined with a loss of the muscle tissue that houses those mitochondria. That is the real picture, not a vague slowing down, a specific, measurable change in how your cells produce energy. And once you understand that this is the real problem, not calories, not willpower, not age as some abstract force, you can begin to understand why certain compounds, delivered at the right time, in the right way, can support those struggling mitochondria directly. Now, before we talk about what to add to your coffee, we need to understand what coffee itself is already doing inside your body. Because coffee is not a passive drink, it is pharmacologically active. It does real, measurable things to your metabolism. The question is whether those things are enough, especially after 60. When you drink a cup of coffee, the caffeine in it is absorbed through your stomach and small intestine and reaches your bloodstream within about 15 to 45 minutes. From there, it crosses into nearly every tissue in your body, including your brain. One of the first things caffeine does is block a molecule called adenosine. Adenosine is a signaling molecule that builds up in your brain throughout the day. Its job is to make you feel tired. It is your body's way of saying, you have been awake long enough, time to rest. Caffeine sits in the same receptors that adenosine normally binds to, but instead of activating them, it blocks them. That is why coffee makes you feel more alert. It is not giving you energy. It is temporarily preventing your brain from receiving the "you are tired" signal. But caffeine does more than block sleepiness. It also triggers your adrenal glands to release catecholamines, a group of hormones that includes adrenaline and noradrenaline. These hormones shift your body into a higher state of activation. Your heart rate increases slightly. Your blood pressure may rise a small amount. And this is the part relevant to metabolism. Your body begins to break down stored fat at a faster rate. This process is called lipolysis. Fat cells release fatty acids into your bloodstream, making them available as fuel. At the same time, caffeine increases something called thermogenesis. That is simply your body generating heat. When thermogenesis increases, you burn more calories not through movement, but just through heat production. A 1,980 study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by Atchison and colleagues at the University of Lausanne measured this directly. They gave subjects caffeine and tracked their metabolic rate using indirect calorimetry. They found a measurable increase in resting energy expenditure, the number of calories burned at rest after caffeine consumption. So coffee does three real things to your metabolism. It promotes fat breakdown, it raises heat production, and it temporarily increases your resting calorie burn. These are not marketing claims. They are measurable physiological effects confirmed across multiple studies over decades. So why is that not enough? Here is where age changes the equation. Those catecholamines, the hormones that drive lipolysis and thermogenesis, need receptors on your cells to work. Specifically, they bind to beta-adrenergic receptors on fat cells and muscle cells. In younger adults, those receptors respond well. The signal comes in, the cell responds, fat gets broken down, heat gets generated. But in adults over 60, the sensitivity of those receptors decreases. This is called beta-adrenergic desensitization, and it has been documented in aging research going back to the 1990s. A study by White and colleagues published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism showed that older adults had a significantly blunted lipolytic response to catecholamine stimulation compared to younger subjects. The hormones were present. The receptors simply did not respond as strongly. So when a 65-year-old drinks the same cup of coffee as a 30-year-old, the caffeine still blocks adenosine. The adrenal glands still release adrenaline. But the downstream effect, the actual metabolic boost, is weaker. The signal arrives, but the cells respond less. There is a second problem. Caffeine's metabolic effects are short-lived. The increase in resting energy expenditure, documented in the Atchison study, lasted a few hours. After that, metabolic rate returned to baseline. This is not a flaw, it is simply how stimulants work. They produce acute effects, not sustained adaptation. They push a system temporarily, they do not rebuild it. And that distinction matters enormously after 60. Because the core problem we described in the first section, reduced mitochondrial number, declining mitochondrial efficiency, loss of lean muscle mass, is not a problem of insufficient stimulation. It is a structural decline. Coffee stimulates, but it does not repair. It does not increase the number of mitochondria in your muscle cells. It does not reverse sarcopenia. It does not improve the efficiency of the mitochondria you have left. Think of it this way. If your house has old, inefficient light bulbs, flipping the switch harder does not make the room brighter. The switch works fine. The wiring is intact. The problem is the bulb itself. Caffeine is like flipping the switch more aggressively. It activates the system, but the system's capacity, the hardware, is diminished. This is the gap that most people never think about. They drink coffee and feel more alert, and they assume that alertness means their metabolism is working well. But alertness is a brain effect. It is adenosine blockade in the central nervous system. It tells you very little about what is happening at the mitochondrial level in your muscles, your liver, your metabolically active tissues. Coffee is doing something real. It is just not doing the thing that aging metabolism needs most. It is not reaching the mitochondria. It is not addressing the efficiency problem. It is not restoring the capacity that has been quietly declining for years. So the question becomes, is there something that can? Something that works at the level of the mitochondria themselves? something that does not just stimulate the system from the outside, but supports the internal machinery that has been wearing down. Something that, when combined with what coffee already does, could produce a measurable metabolic shift, not just a temporary spike. And that is exactly what the research has been pointing toward: a specific compound that targets the part of your cellular machinery that caffeine cannot reach. The compound is cinnamon, specifically Ceylon cinnamon, sometimes labeled as true cinnamon or cinnamomum verum, not a supplement pill, not a powder marketed with exaggerated claims on the label. Cinnamon, the spice, between half a teaspoon and 1 teaspoon, stirred into your morning coffee. That may sound underwhelming, and I understand why. When people hear about a metabolic intervention, they expect something exotic, something new, something with a complicated name. But the reason cinnamon deserves serious attention, especially for adults over 60, has nothing to do with trends or wellness culture. It has to do with what this compound does at the cellular level, inside the very mitochondrial system we have been talking about. Let me explain how it works, and I will be specific because vague claims help no one. Cinnamon contains a bioactive compound called cinnamaldehyde. This is the molecule responsible for cinnamon's flavor and smell. But cinnamaldehyde also does something inside your cells that is directly relevant to aging metabolism. First, cinnamaldehyde has been shown to improve insulin sensitivity. Insulin is the hormone your pancreas releases after you eat. Its job is to help glucose, the sugar from your food, move from your bloodstream into your cells, where it can be used for energy. When your cells respond well to insulin, glucose moves efficiently. When they do not, a condition called insulin resistance, glucose stays in the blood longer than it should. Your pancreas has to produce more insulin to compensate. Over time, this becomes a serious problem. In adults over 60, insulin resistance is extremely common. The reasons connect directly to what we covered earlier. Less muscle mass means fewer cells available to absorb glucose. Less efficient mitochondria means those cells are worse at processing the glucose they do receive. The result is a metabolic environment where blood sugar stays elevated longer after meals, insulin stays elevated longer, and the whole system drifts toward dysfunction. A 2003 study, led by Alam Khan, published in Diabetes Care, examined the effects of cinnamon on metabolic markers in people with type 2 diabetes. Subjects received between 1 and 6 grams of cinnamon daily for 40 days. The results showed significant reductions in fasting, glucose, triglycerides, LDL cholesterol, and total cholesterol compared to placebo. The lowest dose, 1 gram per day, roughly half a teaspoon, produced effects comparable to the higher doses. That study was not the last. A 2013 meta-analysis by Allen and colleagues, published in the Annals of Family Medicine, reviewed 10 randomized controlled trials and confirmed that cinnamon consumption was associated with statistically significant decreases in fasting glucose and improvements in lipid profiles. The effects were modest. They were not dramatic, but they were consistent and measurable. Now, here is where the mitochondrial connection comes in. More recent research has shown that cinnamaldehyde activates specific metabolic pathways inside cells, particularly a pathway called AMPK. This stands for AMP-activated protein kinase. You do not need to memorize that name. What you need to understand is what AMPK does. AMPK is sometimes described as your cell's fuel gauge. When energy inside a cell is running low, when ATP levels drop, AMPK switches on. And when it switches on, it triggers a series of responses designed to restore energy balance. It tells the cell to burn more fat for fuel. It tells the cell to take in more glucose from the bloodstream. And this is critical. It promotes the production of new mitochondria. That process is called mitochondrial biogenesis, literally, the birth of new mitochondria. This is the mechanism that caffeine alone cannot activate. Coffee stimulates energy expenditure from the outside through adrenaline, through thermogenesis, but it does not trigger the internal repair signal that tells your cells to build more power generators. AMPK activation does. Cinnamaldehyde has been shown to activate AMPK in both muscle cells and fat cells. A 2017 study by Kwan and colleagues from the University of Michigan, published in the journal Metabolism, demonstrated that cinnamaldehyde activated thermogenic pathways in human adipocytes, fat cells taken from human subjects. The compound increased expression of genes involved in fat metabolism and energy expenditure at the cellular level. The researchers specifically noted that the effect was mediated through metabolic signaling, not through the nervous system. This is an important distinction. It means the mechanism is different from caffeine. It is complementary, not redundant. So when you combine what coffee does, blocking adenosine, increasing catecholamines, promoting short-term thermogenesis, with what cinnamaldehyde does, improving insulin sensitivity, activating AMPK, supporting mitochondrial biogenesis, you get two different pathways working on the same problem from different directions. One pushes the system from the outside, the other supports it from the inside. Now, why does coffee work well as a delivery vehicle? Two reasons. First, the warm liquid helps dissolve cinnamaldehyde and makes it more readily absorbed in the upper digestive tract. You do not need coffee specifically. Warm water would work too, but since many people already drink coffee in the morning, it is a practical and consistent vehicle. Second, timing matters. Drinking coffee with cinnamon in the morning means the insulin-sensitizing effects of cinnamaldehyde are active during your first meal of the day, when glucose management matters most. Morning is when cortisol, a hormone that naturally raises blood sugar, is at its peak. Having cinnamaldehyde already circulating at that point helps counterbalance that cortisol-driven glucose rise. One important distinction. I said Ceylon cinnamon specifically. Most cinnamon sold in grocery stores, especially in the United States, is cassia cinnamon, which is a different species. Cassia contains significantly higher levels of a compound called coumarin. In high doses, coumarin can stress the liver. The German Federal Institute for Risk Assessment has published guidelines noting that regular cassia cinnamon consumption at therapeutic doses may exceed safe coumarin limits, particularly in older adults with any degree of reduced liver function. Ceylon cinnamon contains only trace amounts of coumarin. For daily use, especially in adults over 60, Ceylon is the appropriate choice. Dosing is straightforward, between half a teaspoon and 1 teaspoon per day. That range aligns with the doses used in the CON study and subsequent trials. More is not better. There is no evidence that exceeding 1 teaspoon produces additional metabolic benefit, and there is no reason to push the dose higher. And one more boundary that must be stated clearly. If you are currently taking medication for diabetes, blood pressure, or blood thinning, you should talk to your doctor before adding daily cinnamon. Cinnamaldehyde can enhance the glucose-lowering effects of diabetic medications, which in some cases could push blood sugar lower than intended. This is not dangerous for most people, but it is something your physician should know about. But knowing what to add and why it works is only half the picture. The next question is, what actually happens inside your body in the first 7 days, and how much of that change is real versus exaggerated? This is the part of the video where I need to be very careful with you, and very honest. The title of this video says, Your Metabolism Responds in 7 Days. I chose that wording deliberately. I did not say transforms. I did not say resets. I did not say fixes. I said responds. And there is a meaningful difference between a response and a resolution. Understanding that difference is what separates real medical information from the kind of content that wastes your time. So let me walk you through what the published data actually shows and what it does not. When researchers study the metabolic effects of a dietary compound like cinnamon, they measure specific biomarkers. These are objective, quantifiable indicators of what is happening inside the body. The most commonly measured markers in short-term cinnamon studies are fasting blood glucose, postprandial glucose, that means blood sugar measured after a meal, fasting insulin levels, and in some cases, resting energy expenditure. Fasting glucose is the simplest to understand. You wake up in the morning, you have not eaten for at least 8 hours, and your blood is drawn. The glucose level in that blood sample tells you how well your body managed its blood sugar overnight without any food coming in. In a healthy system, fasting glucose stays within a relatively narrow range. In a system with insulin resistance, which, as we discussed, is common after 60 fasting, glucose tends to creep upward over time. Several of the clinical trials on cinnamon have measured fasting glucose at multiple time points. In the CON study from 2003, fasting glucose was measured at baseline and then at 20-day intervals over 40 days. Reductions in fasting glucose were already detectable at the first follow-up measurement. The reductions were not enormous. They were not the kind of dramatic drop you would see from a pharmaceutical intervention, but they were statistically significant, meaning they were real, not random noise. Now, that study measured at 20-day intervals, not 7. So can we say anything specific about 7 days? A 2006 study by Hlibowitz and colleagues, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, took a different approach. Instead of measuring fasting glucose over weeks, they measured the acute effect of cinnamon on postprandial glucose blood sugar after a meal. Subjects consumed rice pudding with and without 6 grams of cinnamon, and their blood glucose was tracked over 2 hours after the meal. The cinnamon group showed significantly lower blood sugar levels at every measurement point after eating. The gastric emptying rate was also reduced, meaning food moved more slowly from the stomach into the small intestine, which helps prevent sharp glucose spikes. That study measured an immediate, same-day effect, not a 7-day effect. But it tells us something important. Cinnamaldehyde begins influencing glucose metabolism from the very first dose. It does not require weeks of accumulation to start working. The signaling pathways, AMPK activation, insulin receptor sensitization are triggered acutely. Each dose contributes an effect, and those effects, when repeated daily, begin to compound. This is a principle in pharmacology and nutrition called repeated dose accumulation. A single dose produces a small, temporary effect. A second dose the next day produces another small effect, partly building on the residual influence of the first. By day 3, 4, 5, the cumulative influence on your baseline metabolic markers begins to become measurable, not just in a lab with sensitive equipment, but in standard blood glucose readings. Based on the kinetics of cinnamaldehyde absorption and the timeline of AMPK-mediated cellular changes, a reasonable interpretation of the existing data is this. Within the first 7 days of consistent daily cinnamon intake at half a teaspoon to 1 teaspoon, most adults over 60 with some degree of insulin resistance can expect a detectable change in postprandial glucose handling. Their blood sugar after meals will likely peak lower and return to baseline faster than it did before. Some individuals may also see a small reduction in fasting glucose within that window, though for many, that change becomes more consistent after 2 to 4 weeks of continued use. This aligns with the timeline reported in the Allen meta-analysis from 2013, where the average duration of trials showing significant fasting glucose reduction was between 4 and 18 weeks. So, here is the honest framing. 7 days is enough time for your body to begin responding. It is enough time for the insulin-sensitizing effects of cinnamaldehyde to start shifting your glucose handling in a measurable direction. It is enough time for AMPK activation to begin influencing how your cells process fuel. 7 days is not enough time for mitochondrial biogenesis to be completed. Building new mitochondria is a slower process. Research on AMPK-driven mitochondrial biogenesis, including work by Bergeron and colleagues published in the American Journal of Physiology, indicates that detectable increases in mitochondrial density require weeks to months of sustained AMPK activation. This is not a failure of cinnamon, it is simply how biology works. Building new cellular structures takes time, the signal starts early, the construction takes longer. 7 days is also not enough time to reverse years of metabolic decline. If you have been losing mitochondrial function and muscle mass for a decade, 1 week of cinnamon in your coffee does not undo that. Anyone who tells you otherwise is not being honest with you. What 7 days can do, and what the evidence supports, is initiate a measurable shift in the right direction. Your glucose response begins to improve. Your cells begin receiving a signal to increase energy production. The metabolic environment inside your body starts to change. That is a response, a real one, a physiologically defensible one. But it is the beginning of a process, not the end of one. The people who will see the most noticeable change in 7 days are those with the most room to improve, adults over 60, with higher than optimal fasting glucose, some degree of insulin resistance, and a sedentary or semi-sedentary lifestyle. If your metabolic markers are already well controlled, the effect will be smaller and slower to notice. That is not because the compound is not working. It is because your system has less distance to travel. I want to be very precise about this because I think you deserve precision. Cinnamon is not a drug. It is not a replacement for metformin or any prescribed medication. It is a food-derived compound with demonstrated bioactivity that, at the right dose, in the right form, consistently and measurably influences glucose metabolism and cellular energy signaling. The effect size is modest. The evidence is real. And the timeline for initial response is short enough that most people will notice something within the first week if they are paying attention to the right markers. Still, a metabolic response in the first 7 days only matters if it connects to a larger pattern, one that accounts for everything your body is managing at once, not just blood sugar after breakfast. Let me bring everything back to one clear picture. Your body after 60 is not broken. It is not failing. It is operating with less capacity than it used to have, specifically at the mitochondrial level. The power generators inside your cells are fewer in number and less efficient than they were 20 or 30 years ago. That single change, quiet, invisible, never announced by any symptom you can point to, is behind much of what people experience as aging metabolism, the slower recovery, the easier weight gain, the energy that fades earlier in the day, the blood sugar that stays elevated a little longer after every meal. That is the upstream problem. Everything else flows from it. Coffee Real, caffeinated coffee, addresses part of the equation. It activates your nervous system. It promotes short-term fat breakdown. It raises your resting calorie burn for a few hours. These are genuine effects, confirmed by decades of metabolic research going back to the Atchison study and beyond. But those effects operate on the surface of the system. They push the machinery harder without improving the machinery itself. For a 25-year-old with thousands of healthy mitochondria per cell, that push is enough. For someone over 60 with declining mitochondrial density and function, it is not. Ceylon cinnamon, half a teaspoon to 1 teaspoon per day, reaches the part that caffeine cannot. Cinnamaldehyde improves how your cells respond to insulin, which means glucose moves out of your blood and into your cells more efficiently. It activates AMPK, the internal fuel gauge that tells your cells to burn more fat, take in more glucose, and over time build new mitochondria. These are not surface-level effects. They are structural. They operate inside the cell at the level where the real decline is happening. When you combine the two, caffeine working from the outside, cinnamaldehyde working from the inside, you are not doubling one effect. You are covering two different aspects of the same metabolic problem. One keeps the system active. The other helps rebuild the system's capacity. That distinction is the entire point of this video. But I need to separate two things clearly before we finish, because confusing them is where most people go wrong. There is a difference between symptom control and cause regulation. Symptom control means you manage what you feel. You drink coffee, you feel more alert, your energy seems better for a few hours. That is symptom control. It is useful, it is real. But it does not change the underlying trajectory. Cause regulation means you influence the mechanism that is producing the symptoms in the first place. Improving insulin sensitivity is cause regulation. Activating AMPK is cause regulation. Supporting mitochondrial biogenesis, even slowly, even modestly, is cause regulation. You are not masking the problem. You are working on the structure that created it. Most metabolic advice people receive over 60 is symptom control dressed up as a solution. Eat less, move more. Take this supplement for energy. Drink green tea. Those things are not harmful. Some of them are helpful, but very few of them address the specific cellular level machinery that is actually declining. What I have described today is not a cure. It is not a miracle. It is a small, evidence-supported, daily action that targets the right level of the problem, the mitochondrial level, using a compound with demonstrated bioactivity at a dose that is safe for most adults over 60, delivered through a vehicle most people already use every morning. The metabolic response in the first 7 days is real. It is the beginning of a shift in how your cells handle energy. Whether that shift becomes meaningful over months and years depends on consistency. 1 cup with cinnamon on a Tuesday, forgotten by Thursday, will not produce lasting change. Daily repetition is what allows repeated dose accumulation to work. Daily repetition is what keeps AMPK activated. Daily repetition is what gives mitochondrial biogenesis the sustained signal it needs to actually produce new cellular machinery. And cinnamon alone is not the complete answer. Nothing is. If you are over 60 and you are not engaging in any form of resistance exercise, even basic body weight movement, you are losing the muscle tissue that houses your mitochondria. No compound can fully compensate for that. If your sleep is consistently poor, your cortisol will remain elevated, your insulin sensitivity will suffer, and the benefits of cinnamaldehyde will be blunted. These systems are connected. They always are. What cinnamon in your coffee does is give your cells a specific, targeted signal, one that aging has been gradually weakening at a time of day when that signal matters most. It is a small adjustment with a defensible mechanism and a measurable effect. That is what this video is about. Not a secret, not a trick. A piece of biology explained clearly, so you can make your own informed decision. If you found this useful, consider subscribing to We Care Health. I make these videos to explain how your body actually works, not to sell you something, not to scare you, but to give you the kind of information that a good doctor would give you if they had more than 12 minutes in an appointment. I am Dr. Warren Hung. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.